I stood there under the scorching October sun of 1880 in the middle of our little town square where the smell of dirt and sweat mingled like a reminder of the harshness of the West. The crowd gathered, their noise like a swarm of bees, but all I felt was a cold void in my chest. I had lived here for 20 years, building my farm from scratch, pouring sweat and blood into the fields to turn them into a thriving cattle ranch. But today, I had not come for the land or the cattle. I had come for a promise to my dead wife, Hannah, whose gentle eyes still haunted me at night. And now, on the wooden platform before me, a young girl was being auctioned off like a cow. Abigail Harper, only 20, stood there, her hands shaking, her blue eyes trying to hide the terror of her life. I felt my heart constrict. I was not one to join a crowd. I had always stood on the edge, watching, letting the town's whispers drift by like the wind through the meadow. But today, I could no longer stand on the sidelines. Every eye in the square was fixed on Abigail, and I knew exactly what was going on in the minds of the men. They did not see a person. They saw a commodity, an opportunity to satisfy their greed or lust. I gripped the reins tightly in my hands, fighting back the anger that was rising. I had seen too much injustice in this land, but this sight, a girl pushed onto a wooden platform to pay off her dead father's debts, made my blood boil. Abigail stood there, her thin shoulders shaking, her brown hair tousled by the wind, but she did not bow her head. There was something in her eyes, a weak, determined look that reminded me of Hannah. Hannah, who had always told me that the world needed kindness more than cruelty. The square was more crowded than usual. Men, from cattlemen to drunks from the tavern, gathered in groups, whispering and laughing. I heard the cruel words, the dirty jokes, and each word was like a knife stabbing at my heart. They were calling out prices as if Abigail were just an object, not a girl with dreams, fears, and a life that could have been. I stood in the back, my wide-brimmed hat covering my eyes, but I couldn't hide the storm of emotions swirling inside me. I thought of Hannah, of the long nights she'd spent in bed, her voice weak but determined as she'd said to me, "Jacob, if I'm gone, you have to do something good. Find someone who needs help, especially a girl who has no one to protect her. Give them a chance." The promise was seared into my mind, like a scar that would never heal. And now, Abigail Harper is that opportunity. I looked up at the podium where Judge Cornelius Webb stood, sweat beading on his forehead, his voice rising like a roar over the crowd. He was an opportunist, a man in the robes of justice who cared only about money. I knew exactly why he was holding this auction. Abigail's father, a notorious gambler, had left behind a huge debt, and Abigail was the last thing to pay. I clenched my fists, a mixture of helplessness and anger. I had thought that after losing Hannah, I could live alone, with just the farm and the cattle. But as I looked at Abigail standing there, exposed to the eyes of the entire town, I knew I couldn't turn away. Not today, not to this girl. The bidding began. A guy from the bar, his voice slurred from alcohol, shouted, $15. The crowd laughed, as if it were a joke. Another old man, with 2 wives but still greedy, raised the bid to $20. I felt my stomach twist. Those numbers weren't just money. They were the value they were placing on Abigail's life. I looked at the girl, saw her trying to keep her eyes on the floor, as if she looked away, she could disappear from this nightmare. But she couldn't disappear, and I couldn't let her face this fate alone. I stepped forward, feeling as if the world had slowed down. The crowd seemed to fade, their noise becoming a dull background noise. It was just me, Abigail, and the promise I had made to Hannah echoing in my head. I felt my heart pounding, not with fear, but with a burning determination. I couldn't let Abigail fall into the hands of the tavern owner or the greedy old man. I couldn't let her be reduced to something less than human. I had lost Hannah, the light of my life, but I wouldn't let Abigail have her future taken away. $15, another voice rang out, and I felt the blood rush to my head. It was Caleb Vaughn, the notorious bandit feared by the entire town. He wasn't here for the good of it, and the way he looked at Abigail made me want to punch him in the face. I couldn't let him touch her. Never. I took a deep breath, fighting back the anger so my voice wouldn't shake. I raised my hand, feeling as if the whole square was looking at me, and shouted, $60! The world fell silent. The noise of the crowd stopped as if cut by a sharp blade. Judge Webb stared at me as if he couldn't believe his ears. Abigail raised her head for the first time during the auction, and her blue eyes found mine in the sea of people. In that moment, I saw fear in her eyes, but also a small glimmer of hope, like a weak flame trying not to be extinguished. I don't know if she understood what I meant, but I know that look will haunt me forever. $60. It was a lot of money, more than most families here made in a year. I could hear the whispers starting to spread, the whispers about a widower farmer like me spending so much money. What did they think of me? That I was a lonely old man looking for fun? That I was trying to buy a young wife? I didn't care. I wasn't here for them. I was here for Abigail, for the promise to Hannah. And because part of me believed this was my chance to make up for the days I'd spent in pain and loneliness. Judge Webb called out a few more times, but no one dared to raise the bid. Caleb Vaughn looked at me with murderous eyes. But he knew he couldn't fight back. I stood tall, trying to hide the pounding in my chest. When the gavel came down, declaring Abigail sold to me, I felt a mixture of emotions. There was relief, because I'd saved her from those men. There was fear, because I knew the town wouldn't let this go easily, and there was pain, because I knew this action would drag Abigail and me into a storm we weren't ready for. I stepped to the dais, feeling the eyes of the entire town on my back. Abigail stood there, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. When I reached out to help her down, she hesitated, her eyes filled with doubt. I didn't blame her. After all she'd been through, how could she trust a stranger like me? But when her small hand touched mine, I felt a connection, as if fate had brought us together. I made no promises to her then, didn't say a word, but in my heart I swore to protect her, no matter the cost. As I led Abigail out of the square, the murmurs of the crowd rose again, like a poisonous wind. I knew what they were saying, that Jacob Harrow had lost his mind, that I had bought a young girl for dark reasons. But I didn't care. I only knew that, from this moment on, my life and Abigail's would never be the same. I had set out on a path of no return, and whatever lay ahead, danger, pain, or salvation, I would face it, for Abigail, for Hannah, and for myself. I drove the carriage out of the town square, the dust swirling behind the wheels, a whisper of what I had done. Abigail Harper sat beside me, her thin shoulders stiff, her hands clenched in her lap as she tried to hold on to the last shreds of control she had left. I could feel the tension in her, like a trapped wild animal, unsure if I was the one to save her or the one to lead her into another trap. The October sun burned above, the glare forcing me to squint, but it did nothing to dispel the chill in my chest. I had taken Abigail away from the auction, but I knew that was only the beginning of a dangerous path. I said nothing, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know where to start. How could I explain to a girl who had just been sold like cattle that I wasn't the monster she feared? The drive to my farm was long and bumpy, each jolt of the wagon a hammer blow in the silence between us. I glanced at Abigail, saw her eyes fixed straight ahead, as if looking at me would force her to face a truth she wasn't ready for. I didn't blame her. I'd seen her eyes on the auction block, a mix of fear, humiliation, and a steely determination I couldn't help but admire. She was like Hannah in that way, a stubbornness that refused to bend even when the world turned its back on her. But I also knew that trust was a luxury Abigail could no longer afford. I'd bought her for $60, a sum that had stunned the town, but I knew the true cost of the gesture would be paid in the days to come, in blood, sweat, and perhaps tears. My farm loomed on the horizon, a sturdy two-story wooden house with a wide wraparound porch and shady birch trees. It was where Hannah and I had built our dream, where I had thought I would live happily ever after. But since Hannah had died, the house had become an empty shell, filled with memories I dared not touch. I brought the carriage to a stop in front of the porch, the hooves dying away, leaving a heavy silence. Abigail didn't move, as if waiting for my command. I got out, walked around to her, and held out my hand. "You can get out now," I said, trying to keep my voice light, but it sounded dry, as if I had forgotten how to speak to a human. She hesitated, her eyes scanning me, searching for something, perhaps the danger, the evil intent she had been taught to expect from men. I couldn't bear the look. It made me feel like I was part of the injustice she had endured. Finally, she took my hand, her small hand shaking but strong, and I helped her down. I led her into the house, where the afternoon light streamed through the large windows, illuminating the wooden floors in a welcoming way. But I knew for Abigail this was not home. It could be a prison, a place where she would have to face new fears. Inside, the house was spacious but empty. The stone fireplace stood tall in the living room, and the old armchairs that Hannah had loved were still there, ghosts of the past. I took off my hat, hung it on a hook near the door, and turned to look at Abigail. She stood in the middle of the room, her hands clasped tightly across her chest, her eyes darting around the room as if trying to remember the exit. I wanted to say something to ease her fears, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain that I didn't want to possess her, that I just wanted to keep my promise to Hannah? How could I convince her that I wasn't one of the men in the square who saw her as a commodity? Finally, I pointed toward the stairs. "You'll be in the room upstairs, down the hall," I said, my voice hoarse from lack of use. "The door locks from the inside. You'll be safe there." I saw her blink, surprise flashing across her face, as fast as the wind. An inside lock? Ascorbic acid is not a biological catalyst, but an organic compound found in food and the human body, playing an important role in many biological processes. It is a powerful antioxidant, helping to protect cells from damage by free radicals, supporting collagen production, enhancing iron absorption, and strengthening the immune system. Ascorbic acid is commonly found in citrus fruits, bell peppers, and green vegetables. An ascorbic acid deficiency can lead to scurvy, with symptoms such as fatigue, swollen gums, and slow wound healing. Supplementing ascorbic acid through foods or supplements can help prevent and treat this deficiency. My house, once my home with Hannah, was as silent as a tomb. Abigail stood in the middle of the living room, her eyes scanning the wooden walls and the stone fireplace, as if searching for some sign of who I was, what I wanted from her. I felt my heart sink, not just from the suspicion in her eyes, but from the weight of the promise I had carried for the past 3 years. Hannah, my beloved wife, was gone, leaving me with a large farm and a broken heart. But before she closed her eyes, she made me promise something, a promise I had thought impossible, to find a young girl in need, to give her a home, a family. And now, Abigail Harper, the girl who had just been auctioned off as merchandise, stood before me, my chance to keep that promise. I cleared my throat, trying to find the right words, but they slid off my tongue like dry sand. "Abigail," I began, my voice hoarse, as if I had forgotten how to speak to another person. "You don't have to be afraid of me. I didn't buy you for the reasons the town is saying." She raised her head, her blue eyes sharp and suspicious. I didn't blame her. After everything she'd been through, losing her father, being auctioned off, being exposed to the greedy gaze of the entire town, how could she trust anyone? But that look, that mix of fear and resilience, reminded me of Hannah, and it broke my heart. I gestured toward the fireplace where Hannah's picture sat on the pedestal, her gentle eyes seeming to stare right into mine, urging me on. "My wife, Hannah, died 3 years ago," I said, feeling as though each word was tearing open an old wound. "She was sick, with cancer, and it was taking her away little by little. Before she died, she made me promise to find a young girl, someone who had no one to protect her, and give her a home. She said she couldn't rest knowing there were people like her out there, unsheltered, unprotected." Abigail blinked, surprise flashing across her face, but the doubt remained, an impenetrable wall. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice shaky but defiant. "Why would you do this? Why spend $60 on someone like me? No one does anything without expecting something in return." Her words stabbed me, not because they hurt, but because they reminded me of the cruelty of this world, a world that had taught her that kindness always came with a price. I turned away, not wanting her to see the pain in my eyes. I walked to the mantelpiece, touched Hannah's frame, felt the cold wood under my fingertips. "I know what the town thinks," I said, my voice low, as if talking to myself. "They think I'm some lonely old man, buying a young girl to satisfy his sick desires. But I don't care what they say. I'm doing this for Hannah, for the promise I made to her. And because I believe you, Abigail, deserve a chance to live, to not be crushed by this world." She was silent, but I could feel the tension in her, like a string being pulled to its limit. I turned, looking her straight in the eye, trying to make her see my sincerity. "You are not my property," I said, my voice stronger, as if I were trying to convince both of us. "You are a person, and I want you to have a safe place to call home. If you want to leave, I won't make you. But I hope you will stay, at least until we figure out a way to give you a better life." Before Abigail could reply, a sound from outside cut through the silence. The sound of hooves, rapid and heavy, was approaching. I felt my blood run cold. I knew immediately that these were not friends. This town had never left me alone, and now, as I had dropped Abigail off, trouble was knocking at the door. I went to the window, pulled aside the curtains, and saw the silhouettes of 6 men on horseback, led by Caleb Vaughn, a notorious bandit with steely eyes. He was not here out of kindness, and I knew that his presence had something to do with Abigail, or rather, with the secrets her father had left behind. I turned to Abigail, saw her cowering, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay here," I said, my voice firm but not without concern. "Stay away from the windows." She nodded, but I could see she was struggling to keep her composure. I took my rifle from the rack by the door, the weight of it in my hand sobering me. I wasn't a violent person, but I'd learned that in this land, sometimes you have to protect what's important at all costs. When I stepped onto the porch, Caleb Vaughn dismounted, his evil smile making me want to punch him in the face. "Jacob Harrow," he said, his voice smooth as a snake. "We hear you paid a fortune for that girl. We just came to check that everything was right." I tightened my grip on the gun, fighting back my anger. I knew he wasn't here to check anything. He wanted Abigail, or worse, he wanted something her father had left behind, a secret I didn't know, but I had a feeling it would be deadly. "She's under my protection," I said, my voice as cold as the winter wind. "You have no business here. Go away." Vaughn laughed, but his eyes were not laughing. He stepped closer, and I felt my heart pounding, not in fear for myself, but for Abigail. I had promised to protect her, and I would not let anyone touch her, not even at the cost of my life. But when I looked into Vaughn's eyes, I knew that this was only the beginning of a storm, and Abigail, like it or not, was at the center of it. Night had fallen over my farm like a black blanket, but the torches of Caleb Vaughn's men lit up the front yard. I stood on the porch, my rifle clutched in my hand, the cold feel of the metal, a reminder that this night would not end without bloodshed. Abigail stood behind me, in the shadows of the house, but I could feel her fear, an electric current through the air. I had promised to protect her, but now, with 6 armed men standing before me, led by a notorious bandit, I began to wonder if I could keep that promise. Caleb Vaughn stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry ground. "Harrow," he said, his voice smooth but menacing. "We don't want any trouble. Just hand over the girl and we'll leave you alone." I felt my blood boil. He spoke of Abigail as if she were a commodity, something to be traded, and it made me want to lunge forward and strangle him. But I kept my cool, knowing that any mistake now could cost us both our lives. "She's not going anywhere," I said, my voice as hard as stone. "She's my family and this is my land. You're not welcome here." The word family slipped out of my mouth before I could think, but it felt right. Abigail wasn't just a girl I'd bought at auction. She was someone I'd sworn to protect, the way I'd protected Hannah, and I wouldn't let anyone take her from me. Vaughn laughed, a cold laugh that made my skin crawl. "Family, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think you can buy a girl and turn her into something noble? Her father took what was not his, Harrow. That gold is mine, and I will take it back, if I have to burn this farm to the ground." I felt my heart constrict. Gold? What had Abigail's father done to anger a man like Vaughn? I didn't know, but I knew that Abigail was in danger, and I wouldn't let her face it alone. Before I could answer, Abigail stepped out of the shadows, clutching a small leather bag. I turned, stunned to see her standing there, her blue eyes burning with a determination I had never seen before. "This is what you want," she said, her voice trembling but strong, as she held up the bag. The light from the torch illuminated the bag, and I recognized it instantly. It was gold, gold her father had stolen, gold that Vaughn and his men would kill to get back. "Abigail, no," I shouted, but she shook her head, her eyes locked on Vaughn. "If I give it to you, will you leave Mr. Harrow alone?" she asked, her voice ringing with a bravery that both flattered and frightened me. I wanted to pull her back, tell her to run, but I knew she had made her choice. She didn't want me to die because of her, and this act, her willingness to face Vaughn, was a testament to her strength. Vaughn laughed, but his eyes gleamed with greed as he looked at the bag of gold. "Give it to me, girl," he said, "and perhaps we will spare you both." But I knew he was lying. I had seen men like Vaughn before, men who wanted more than gold, but wanted to send a message to let the world know that no one could cross them. I clenched my pistol, ready to fight, but before anyone could act, another voice rang out from the darkness. "Caleb Vaughn, put down your weapons!" It was Sheriff Elias Stone, his voice booming like thunder. Through the window, I saw more torches appear surrounding the farm. Elias was back, leading a militia from the town. I felt a spark of hope in my chest, but I knew the fight was not over. Vaughn was a cornered animal, and such animals were the most dangerous. Vaughn turned, his eyes flashing with anger as he realized he had fallen into a trap. "Harrow, you will regret this," he growled, his hand reaching for the gun at his waist. I didn't hesitate. I raised the gun, aimed it at him, and in that moment, time stood still. I didn't want to kill, but I would do anything to protect Abigail, and when the first shot rang out, I knew that tonight would change everything. 3 months after that fateful night, I stood in front of the town's little church, feeling as if my whole world had changed. Abigail stood beside me in the simple white dress she had sewn herself, her brown hair shining in the winter sun. She smiled, a smile I had never seen before. No fear, no doubt, just pure joy. The whole town had gathered to witness this moment, the day Abigail Harper became Abigail Harrow, the day I found a new family after years of loneliness. The night Caleb Vaughn and his men attacked my farm is only a memory now, but it is burned into my mind like a scar. When the shots rang out, I thought it would be the end of me, of Abigail, of everything I had built. But Sheriff Elias Stone and his militia arrived just in time, turning Vaughn's trap into his own. When the smoke cleared, Vaughn lay dead on my floor, and his men surrendered unconditionally. The gold Abigail's father had left behind was turned over to the authorities, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. But what really changed me was not the victory over Vaughn, but Abigail. The girl I had brought home from the auction, who had stood up to her enemies with a bravery I had never seen before, became an indispensable part of my life. After that night, she stayed on the farm, and we began to build a relationship based on trust and respect. I taught her how to care for livestock, how to ride horses, and she taught me how to laugh again, how to find joy in the little things I had forgotten since Hannah died. Our wedding day was not lavish, but it was filled with love. As Abigail walked down the aisle, I felt my heart melt. She was no longer the scared girl on the auction block. She was a strong woman who chose me, not because I saved her, but because she saw in me a man worth trusting. As we exchanged vows, I looked into her eyes and saw a future where I was no longer alone, no longer haunted by the ghosts of the past. The town, which had once whispered about me with venom, now looked at us with admiration. They told the story of the farmer who bought a girl at auction and gave her a new life. But for me, it wasn't a hero story. It was the story of Abigail, of her resilience, of how she turned an act of kindness into a lasting relationship. And as we walked back to the farm, now our home, I knew Hannah was smiling somewhere, pleased that I had kept my promise.